Zin and the team at Kenred, Prof Christie and Sonwabo and others. This has been an attempt to really give effect to this idea of really putting the university in a position where it's looking beyond itself in terms of creating a space for knowledge and dialogue. And the approach here has been what one may call an intergenerational approach. We have the privilege of talking to Raymond Suttner and having him lead this pilot series to see if we can really get to push ourselves as an institution into a way of doing things that's not about just looking at received wisdom from the halls of the university, but from people who actually lived through historical events and people who have their own memories and great ethics. Of course, Raymond is a scholar as well, but the intent here is to bring to bear his scholarship, his lived experience, and the rest of it. Raymond, I was just revisiting Luli's book on Oliver Tambo, and again, looking at her comment on how you suffered torture. And I thought to myself, it's quite remarkable to read things in books and yet still live with the people who've lived through these things. So to us, you're a living book. The discussant for today is a young emerging scholar, Samkelo Mngadi, who is a master's student, a history master's student at Rhodes University. And I just want to welcome you, Samkelo. There have been other young interlocutors with Raymond, and they don't give him an easy time. It is an engagement. It is an engagement. And I think one of our attempts here at Nelson Mandela University is to really respect the concept of the university as a space for critical engagement and not one for praise singing or for limiting discussion. So welcome. I see there are other people who are here. Professor Janet Cherry, who herself is a living archive. I may not know others, but I do hope that they raise their voices and talk. I see Rodney's here, Professor Uchenna Okeja. There may be others that I may not know your names, but I do hope you will participate. So with that, thank you, Raymond. You may take the platform.
Thank you. I think it's something unstable because I was lost when you were referring to Luli, but let me move on. I'm very pleased to have this opportunity to talk on Chief Luthuli. I feel that Luthuli is one of the heroic figures of our struggle who has been neglected, and I do my bit to try to remedy that. I think it's important not to look at him as some sort of archaeological relic, but as an ethical figure who has a lot of relevance as a leader to the problems that we face today. When you speak of ethical leadership, it's important to be able to give it content, and looking at Luthuli's life helps us to do that. I also believe, despite not being a believer myself, that we have to engage with Luthuli's Christianity, an active social gospel which governs his life, but not in a hierarchical sense where Christianity stands looking down on every other belief system. He has a range of identities that he inhabits and that other people with whom he interacts inhabit, and he respects it. Now, to start off with his Christianity, we know his book is called Let My People Go, and he immediately evokes a biblical vision. And in the foreword to the book, he concludes by saying, "May God's will, holy and perfect, be realized in our world." And I think it's very important for us to interpret what he means by it. The word perfection, I think, is to be understood with a certain restlessness in relation to injustice. The word perfection must be understood in relation to Luthuli's continued reference to the need for divine discontent. Now, the words divine discontent are also used by the famous African-American scholar W.E.B. Du Bois, who refers to define divine discontent in relation to the imperfections of the world. So that when Luthuli invokes his Christianity and the notion of divine discontent, it is not in order to ask the Lord to rescue the people of South Africa from oppression. It is in order to invoke our own sense of discontent with the conditions under which we were living then, and to do something about it, because Luthuli has nothing but contempt for the idea of living with injustice and living under oppression with a sense of contentment that there's nothing that one can do about it. Luthuli is very concerned that some people think he's a moderate, and he's very clear that he is a militant. In this contribution, I refer also to Luthuli's commitment to non-violence. And there's been a lot of debate over whether or not Luthuli supported the armed struggle. Now, I don't myself want to get stuck on that, but I have written elsewhere in an article that is referred to there, and so has Robert Vinson in his biography of Luthuli, which is very good. I would urge you to get it. It's on Lut. I argue there that Luthuli reluctantly came to accept armed struggle. However, it's very important for us to understand that resort to armed struggle was not a principle. It was an exception from a general commitment that we all ought to have towards peace and non-violence. Because peace is not something for sissies. Peace is a condition for the existence of all human rights. You cannot have people beating up people with whom they disagree. Armed struggle was justified because the apartheid regime went to war with the people of South Africa. But it was an exception from a general rule that one has to live in peace with one's brothers and sisters. Any time where one wreaks violence against another human being is to reify them, treat them as a thing. And it's important that we recognize that it is only justified to take up arms in exceptional circumstances. So what I'm arguing then with Luthuli is that although I do believe he did accept and support the armed struggle, in fact, his Nobel Prize money was used to buy farms in Swaziland that were used in support of the struggle, including MK. Although he did that, that was not a generalized acceptance of the use of force. It was a recognition that there are particular conditions when it is justified and necessary to take up arms. Luthuli, I refer to Luthuli being an ethical leader. He refers to the notion of a gospel of service. We live now in a time of a gospel of greed, where people believe that leadership entitles them to take what they can as a reward for being a leader, whereas Luthuli believed that the way you lead is to serve to the best of your ability. Much of the book, much of his autobiography and much of his life has a prophetic element. He calls the chapter when people keep on asking him to make himself available as a chief. He refers to it as the call of my village. Now, the word call is used along with the notion of prophecy. Prophecy does not refer to fortune telling. It means reading the signs of your times. Now, Luthuli read the signs of his times, and he acted out what he required, what he believed was necessary. Even if it brought him into danger. When he was deposed as a chief, he made the famous statement called, "The road to freedom is via the cross." In other words, recognizing that he had to be prepared to die. And he says, it's on page 11 or 12, I do not know what the future holds for me. What the future has in store for me, I do not know. It might be ridicule, imprisonment, a concentration camp, flogging, banishment, and even death. It is inevitable that in working for freedom, some individuals and some families have to take the lead and suffer. The road to freedom is via the cross. Now, in saying that he had to be prepared to sacrifice, Luthuli, like Mandela and like Gandhi, recognized that saying you are willing to die, saying that you are willing to sacrifice, required preparation. And Gandhi had a lot of emphasis on vows. And in the Defiance campaign, Luthuli heard of the Defiance campaign when he was on the way to an ANC conference, because the previous president of the Natal ANC, AWG champion, had not informed the other members of the leadership that there was this proposal for a Defiance campaign. And when he got to the conference, he said to the people there, "Please, can Natal come in later because we are not ready?" And someone shouted, "Coward, coward." And he said, "Rather let me express my my lack of preparation now than that I'm later disappoint you and am not ready to take part." And when he went back after the conference, there was a meeting in Durban where he said to the rest of the members of the executive, "You're asking other people to make sacrifices, to be prepared to go to jail and even to die, because the Defiance campaign participants were known as defiers of death because they were willing to give their lives. Now, are we all ready?" And he asked every one of them to swear an oath of readiness. They then prayed and they went out. So what Luthuli was doing was what Mandela has also said about willingness to die in the Rivonia trial. You mustn't say that you're willing to die if you haven't prepared yourself properly for it. Chris Hani used to also say to people when were about to cross the border, "Are you sure you're ready? Have you not got some unfinished business here that can affect you on this mission?" He didn't want to have martyrs just for the sake of martyrs. He wanted people to go into things when they were ready. And that's a very important thing for us to remember in this time. We mustn't say that we are prepared to do various things that require courage unless we have readied ourselves psychologically for that. Now, Luthuli was a Christian, but most of the members of his community in Grattville, the members of his council as chief were Amabeshu, the people who were not believers in Christianity. And he taught his children that you have a lot to learn from these people. Let's listen to them. And the Amabeshu had their own praise songs. As they came into Luthuli's house, they would sing their own praises to him. And what is very important for us to learn from this is that we have to engage with one another with mutual respect, no matter what our belief systems may be. Whether we are Marxists, Christians, liberals, whatever it happens to be, we need to listen to one another and learn from one another. And in the village, Luthuli for the first time introduced as chief the participation of women. Women had not previously been allowed to be part of the proceedings within the community, chiefly community, and he introduced this for the first time. And that was part of a general gender awareness of Luthuli. It was uneven, but it was before he was not exposed to the writings on feminism. However, he was very involved in promoting the leadership of women, people like Lillian Goy and Dorothy Nyembe, amongst others. I heard about this from Dorothy Nyembe in the 1980s, how she was trained by Chief Luthuli and encouraged to do what she did. But his commitment to women, we must understand, were not was before the time of feminism. So you find some statements of his that are not completely in line with gender equality. For example, he says, among men, political awareness presupposes a certain sophistication. Among women, awareness of the fundamentals presupposes no such thing. So some of his discourse was not in line with modern feminism, just as his active Christianity, his social gospel, was before the time of liberation theology, even though he practiced many of these ideas. The way Luthuli related to different identities was also manifested in his political tolerance and his political commitment to listen to every belief system. He had a close relationship with people like Alan Paton of the Liberal Party, although he disagreed with the Liberal Party. His closest confidant is said to have been Moses Kotane of the Communist Party. It is repeatedly reported that he would say, but what does Moses say? And when he wanted to hear about an issue which bothered him, he would insist that they should send Kotane down to see him. Likewise, Kotane had this continual respect, despite the fact that Luthuli was in no sense a communist. But he used to read communist things. Billy Nair reports how they used to take the African communists out to him in Grattville secretly. So there was this openness from which we can learn from Luthuli. He was never regarded himself as having a final position on anything, and he was prepared to listen to all people. I think this is one of the reasons why he became a leader, maybe the first leader ever in South Africa, who had a following amongst all sections of the population. He became leader of the ANC in Natal at the time, shortly after the conflict between Africans and Indians. And he built this close relationship with the Indian Congresses. And one of the effects of this closeness was that Ben Magubane told me in an interview that there was an ANC rally in Durban, and the ANC people came out of the rally and they saw the police harassing Indian traders. The ANC people immediately formed a cordon around the Indian traders to protect them. So that was a direct manifestation of the cooperation that had been built, which started to mend the acrimony of the 1949 conflict between Africans and Indians. He went out of his way to build bridges with white communities, and for his troubles got assaulted in Pretoria in one of those meetings. But in Cape Town, people, white and black, formed a line behind him, and they danced singing, "We will follow Luthuli," so Somlandela. So Luthuli, long before, Robert Vincent says Luthuli was Mandela before Mandela, but it may be more correct to say that Mandela was Luthuli after Luthuli in terms of building up this mutual respect with all communities. A lot of my interpretation of Luthuli relates to the imagery that he uses. I've been influenced by Gandhi's use of imagery as ways of conveying his messages. And I think when you look at the way Luthuli dressed, I think you can see that it was never unambiguously pacifist. He said he was not a pacifist, but even in the way he dressed, the way the uniform of the Defiance campaign, but also how he dressed for the Nobel Prize is also open to a range of interpretations, which in some ways foreshadowed his support for the armed struggle. I've mentioned Luthuli's commitment to the advancement of women, but I would like to say it's an example of a strong as well as gentle masculinity. His daughter, Ntombazana Albertina Luthuli, refers to how before he gave any speech, he would ask his wife, Mabengu Nokukanya, to listen and go through it. She would make her points. And she says, after that, Ubaba's confidence was increased. Now, what I think comes out of that statement is that Luthuli had vulnerabilities like all of us, and he didn't believe that as a man he should conceal his vulnerabilities. His daughter was able to pick that up. And I think this is something which we have to take from Luthuli, that he was a strong person who was prepared to die, who was prepared to face punishment, which he did from the apartheid regime, but he was also gentle. His children say he was always there for us. The marriage between Nokukanya and Albert Luthuli was one of equality. In fact, Mabengu was the breadwinner most of the time. She would have to go to bed very early to get out. She was supposedly the first, the earliest farmer in Groutville. And he would stay at night listening to talking with his daughters, and if any of them, if their blankets fell off, he would get up, cover them, tuck them in, or if they were sleepwalking, he would walk them back to their beds. So we get this impression from talking to the daughters that he was not an absent father. He was there for them, always asking about their boyfriends and things like this, and being a wise counsel. So what I've tried to do in what I've written is try to give you an idea of a leader who was a rounded human being. He was a committed Christian, but he was open to a range of other influences, never tried to shut these out of his life. And I think we need to, in a time like we are now experiencing, where people are sometimes despairing about how we are going to get out of the situation of endless corruption, violence, and so forth. We have to be open to learning from a number of people and ideas that we may not previously have considered. So that is the sort of message I would like to convey about Luthuli. He was a giant, but he wasn't an unapproachable giant. He was a giant who was open to all human beings and who counseled respect for all human beings and their belief systems. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that, Prof Suttner. May I invite Samkelo to give his contribution? Thank you.
Okay.
Can we see you?
Can you see me?
Yes, we can see you. Thanks.
All right. Thank you, Prof Suttner, for your paper. And I want to thank Nelson Mandela University for this opportunity to share in the feedback and speak to Prof Suttner's paper as well. Yeah, so this is, just gather my notes quickly. First Nobel Peace Prize recipient being Nkosi Albert John Luthuli, a complex historical figure who does not often occupy the mainstream narrative around South Africa's apartheid history. The paper seeks to make Nkosi Luthuli relevant to our current context, looking at him from an ethical vantage point. I would argue that this is rather relevant given that our current generation has very few moral and ethical political leaders to look up to. There's a tendency within political history and its literature on Nkosi Luthuli to focus on Umkhonto weSizwe. The paper is a welcome breath of fresh air, stepping away from the debate of violence. Prof Suttner is quick to inform the reader that the focus on Nkosi Luthuli is rather on morals and ethics within the political world. The paper makes use of key primary sources, which are Nkosi Luthuli's own autobiography, Let My People Go, and one of his early key speeches, The Road to Freedom via the Cross. I also note that Prof Suttner also makes use of biographies, the most recent body of work on Nkosi Luthuli done by Robert Trent Vincent, Scott Cooper, and Mary Benson, and other journal articles, including his own papers as well, are cited in his references. All of these are used to build his argument for his paper. The paper overall flows in a thematic sequence. The paper contains a religious theme throughout, and I attribute this to who the individual was. Nkosi Luthuli was a man of faith, therefore this theme comes as no surprise. Like Scott Cooper, Prof Suttner asserts that any real engagement or the examination of Nkosi Luthuli cannot be done so without the involvement of his Christian faith. He also came from Amakhola, an economic group the question of an influence did the social group impact Nkosi Luthuli's moral values, given that Nkosi Luthuli did not operate in a vacuum. I also note that it comes to an interest to me that there's a heavy Christian theme, but there's a very little mention of Nkosi Luthuli's role as a lay minister within.
Samkelo, can I ask you to just switch off your video? Because your bandwidth seems to be struggling. So we'll just do audio.
Okay.
Yeah, thanks.
Is that better?
Okay, you can go. Thanks.
Prof Suttner is very clear throughout the paper that Nkosi Luthuli's Christianity exists in a balance with other facets of his life, like his political role and his chieftaincy. But there is a heavy Christian influence present throughout the paper. The discussion around Nkosi Luthuli's imagery fits the theme of balance between the different worlds that Nkosi Luthuli occupies. His ability to marry his political world and his traditional world comes through very clearly through his dress code and how he wore his traditional attire along with his modern attire. Some of the modern political historians and scholars who have critiqued Nkosi Luthuli have often labeled him as either conservative or moderate due to his non-violent approach. And Prof Suttner is very quick to address this by quoting the chief directly in discarding the title of moderate and opting for the title of militant. I do agree with Prof Suttner's caution to the reader to view him within his context, which some historians seem to ignore in their critique of Nkosi Luthuli. Reading the paper, one gets the impression that Prof Suttner is not only speaking about Nkosi Luthuli's life, but to the reader as South Africans too, and what we should be looking for within our own leaders. The reflection around the preparations of the Defiance campaign is an illustration of this notion. Prof Suttner describes Nkosi Luthuli as being a different kind of organized leader compared to his fellow political leaders, even to the point of being called a coward, which he recounts in his own autobiography. This shows us the type of leader Nkosi Luthuli was. Also, the discussion around the element of preparedness is not just about the political organization, but also speaks to one's personal life. The takeaway from this paper is that leaders need not only sacrifice their own lives in the literal sense, like Nelson Mandela going to prison, but also in Nkosi Luthuli's instance, being banned to Grootville and being stripped of his chieftaincy by the apartheid state. The paper does leave a desire for a discussion around his role as chief and whether his active Christianity influenced how he governed as a chief. Does his Christian moral and ethical values influence him not to take the self-enrichment? Historians that discuss Nkosi Luthuli rush very quickly into discussing his political role within the ANC, but his chieftaincy and him being deposed are often left in the dark. The major takeaway from this paper, from my understanding, and what is often lacking within the discourse around Nkosi Luthuli, is the gendered subject. Historians and scholars hardly engage this aspect of Nkosi Luthuli. Prof Suttner's statement that Nkosi Luthuli's view on the empowerment of women is correct, that it was limited given that there was very little evidence to show he was a feminist or engaged with feminist literature, but his actions speak of an infant feminist ideals. It was under his leadership, both within Grootville and within the ANC, brought in the inclusiveness of women within the movement in general compared to his predecessors. The role Mapengu also plays is very important, and how he treats her also speaks to this feminist ideals. She played an equal partner role as a breadwinner and viewing her in the marriage as an equal. I'm also in agreement with Prof Suttner that Nkosi Luthuli also offers us an alternative form of masculinity, with him being a present father, showing tenderness towards his children, and also accepting Mabengu's criticism of his political speeches. Shows that Mabengu was an equal and also criticized his political thought. He does not stay confined to the gendered norms of a Zulu patriarchal household. In conclusion, the paper does well to show the reader that that informs Nkosi Luthuli's moral and ethical values and what leadership ideals Nkosi Luthuli possessed. He shows Luthuli as an active leader with strong non-violent principles, a leader that is viewed by people. A leader that viewed people from diverse groups as his equals and sought the betterment of the lives of both men and women and from different race groups. What I would hope Prof Suttner would include in future, in line with the prophetic role argument within his paper, is what was Nkosi Luthuli's vision for future African leaders, the type of leaders he envisioned for South Africa to strive to be and should be, and hopefully use Nkosi Luthuli's own words to help guide future generations of what type of leaders we should be and aim to be. Thank you.
Thank you, Samkelo. I think I recall reading that on the matter of armed struggle, Nkosi Luthuli apparently said that when your son gets into trouble, he did, ne? When your son gets into trouble by making a young woman pregnant, I think something like that, you now get called after the fact to deal with this issue. So on the matter of these youngsters, wanting armed struggle, it's, well, look, you can only deal with these things after the fact. So it's an interesting sort of paradigm. I think the issue of Albert Luthuli and the armed struggle is probably a very key one in understanding that the politics of that time and how, I think people had to present a kind of a face of, not necessarily appearing to they had to convey a kind of a reluctance around the matter of armed struggle because it was so heavy and so difficult a choice to make. But in fact, I think in practice, they knew they had no alternative. And I thought, Prof Suttner, I would have liked you to talk a little bit more about that kind of tension within the South African liberation tradition around whether or not one comes to take up violence with great reluctance and great kind of, they seem to have gone a long way to kind of show that they were not quite, this was a difficult choice for them. So I wanted you to comment on that as well. What we'll do now is open up for some comments, if there are some right now, and then we will return to the two speakers. I see there's a question there by Rudy Hilleman. Can you please switch on your mic if you want to make that comment? It says, is there any contradiction, misuse in the continued use of basically the word chief rather than the word Nkosi? I note, Samkelo, that you yourself generally use the word Nkosi rather than chief, so perhaps you can comment on that as well. There's a question here by Leila Harper, but it's sent to me, so I'm not sure if you want to make a comment. Are there any questions? Otherwise, I take it back to Prof Suttner around the question of non-violence and versus violence and the decisions around that.
I think you must remember it wasn't just Luthuli. Kotane was also very opposed to armed struggle, not on principle. And Mandela sat the whole night with him and said to him, are you going to trail behind like the Communist Party in Cuba and be outflanked when people are busy burning down cane fields, things like that. People are ready for it. Are you going to hold them back? So that there was a recognition on the side of Kotane and Luthuli that there would have to be some movement, but they didn't want people to go into it unprepared and inadequately prepared. And it wasn't a case that Luthuli recognized it later. They did consult with him the whole night. People came down to Natal. They met somewhere in the cane fields, if I recall correctly. And at the end of the meetings, they took a decision that MK could be formed, but it had to be separate from ANC because of the legality. They didn't want the ANC to also automatically be charged with armed struggle, since it had a lot of people in it who hadn't been part of those discussions. So Luthuli didn't, he wanted to be sure that people had thought it out correctly, and he and Kotane both had held back. But as I indicated to you, his money from the Nobel Prize was used to buy farms in Swaziland. And those farms were used, and that's acknowledged by Cooper, who doesn't accept that Luthuli supported armed struggle, but it's acknowledged by him that those were used for people in transit into the country, although Cooper says it's not known whether they were armed struggle. But armed struggle isn't just when you start fighting. It includes a number of bases along the way, number of forms of infrastructure. And those farms were a very active way in which Luthuli used that money. His daughters, by the way, some of the daughters were complaining that other chiefs had much more money, they wanted a better house and all of that, and they expected the Nobel Prize money to be used to get them a more fancy home. But instead, the money was used. He bought a flat for some of them in Durban, but in other respects, the money was used to buy these farms in Swaziland, and Mabengu used to go and tend for them, and food was grown there, things like that. So I don't think we should exaggerate Luthuli's resistance. I think he just believed that nonviolence is a principle, and he made it clear that he is not a pacifist. If someone tries to steal my chickens, he said, they can see that I'm not a pacifist.
With that in mind, before we move to Samkelo's comment on the use between the English and the Sintu words, can you comment a bit on how the ANC's position on armed struggle kind of evolved into the 90s, and how the tensions between deciding whether to suspend armed struggle or either to continue were resolved, and especially in light of the ways in which people like yourself and Chris Hani viewed the necessity for continuing with armed struggle, and how you yourself perhaps evolved on that position, and in a sense how that sort of Luthuli tradition of really weighing up these options lived on in the ANC of Mandela.
Well, I think that, in a struggle which is conducted in a number of different fronts, one doesn't always know what's going on in others. In the case of many of us, we thought that MK was capable of defeating the apartheid regime on the battlefield. And people like Mandela, as well as the leadership outside in the main, not all of them, came to the conclusion that there was a stalemate, that the apartheid regime was not able to ensure sustainable governance over the long term. Equally, the MK was not able to defeat SADF militarily. And that is why almost simultaneously there was a reaching out from Mandela to the apartheid regime from in prison, but also outside. There were meetings between the intelligence service of the apartheid regime and Thabo Mbeki and Jacob Zuma, amongst others. And so there was a recognition that the people who were dying were primarily the oppressed people of South Africa, and was desirable, if possible, to find a way of resolving this without continued deaths, because the deaths were primarily that of the oppressed. So that was, now inside, people like myself, we didn't know of this thinking. So we were, and in fact, the Communist Party had a meeting in Cuba in 1989, where they continued to call for insurrection. And in fact, Thabo Mbeki chaired that meeting. So there was a sort of sense that we were not kept properly in the picture of what was happening. So when suddenly there were talks and there was suspension of armed action, a lot of people were very unhappy about it. But people, you can argue about every single concession, but the overall perspective of trying to reduce conflict and achieve democracy, I believe in retrospect is justified. Now, Ashley Forbes has got an article in Daily Maverick where he argues that we didn't want revolutionary seizure of power, and that's why we settled, but there couldn't have been revolutionary seizure of power, in my view. So in retrospect, I believe that we were not fully briefed. We didn't fully, some of us, like me, didn't fully understand. Now, Chris Hani did, and he did go and convince people that they must be prepared to make the peace work. So it's not that Chris didn't stay opposed to it.
Just another point, historical point here. Can you just take us back a little bit to the to the Luthuli detachment's deployment to try and come and invade South Africa in the late 60s, and the failure of that in terms of the invasion of South Africa by MK guerrillas. There are a lot of young people here who may need to hear that history from someone actually speaking it. They may not get the opportunity to read it because they spend their time on Twitter and Facebook. But it might help them if you actually just give a sense of how the ANC came in the late 60s to try and see if they can actually invade South Africa, and how that plan for invasion ended up with the sort of confrontation that happened outside of South Africa with the Rhodesian forces with South African support.
Well, in the final paper that I'll be giving, I quote Ron Reed Daly of the Selous Scouts saying that they were taking a battering from the ANC and ZAPU forces, and it could have turned into a rout. So that I think we can exaggerate the extent to which it was a failure, because many of them did acquit themselves well, and at some points the Rhodesian forces were sent running. But on the overall, the ANC read the incursions at Wankie and Sipulilo as being not being successes, and that led to the Morogoro Conference of 1969. People like Chris Hani had written a memorandum where they said that the leadership was spending too much time on diplomacy and not preparing adequately for armed struggle against the apartheid regime. So, and at one point, people wanted Hani to be sentenced to death. Now, that was not carried out. So there was a lot of demoralization after those campaigns. People like Hani, when they retreated, were imprisoned in Botswana. Some ANC comrades spent 10 years in Rhodesian jails after that campaign. So there was a lot of unhappiness, even if it was even if MK did acquit themselves well. What is said, however, is that ZAPU had not prepared the ground adequately in Zimbabwe. So that one of the lessons that they took is that if one were going to conduct armed struggle, one had to do a lot of essential political work on the ground to make the terrain favorable for an armed insurrection. At the Morogoro conference, however, they went and evaluated all of this and prepared for much more long-term armed struggle. And within about 7 years, there was the 1976 uprising. And after that, many young people came into the country, attacked police stations, things like that. So that was a setback on the whole, that campaign, but wasn't an absolute setback in the words of the Rhodesian forces as well.
I mean, in a way that, yeah. Okay.
I'm not an expert on that. I just read about it.
Yeah. Samkelo, perhaps you can get into the question around the use of the word chief versus the word Nkosi to address someone like Albert Luthuli.
I think for me, the reason why I opted to use the translation or like the Zulu word Nkosi, one, it's because of given like my understanding of as a Zulu person myself, understanding the system and how where Nkosi Luthuli lied in the traditional leadership hierarchy. So I think that for me was like to pay homage and respect to his title, given also that how the apartheid state stripped him, and then some writers have not included to his title ex-chief, whereas within Gauteng he was always and still is regarded as Nkosi, and even though the state had stripped him of the title. So for me, the Nkosi is almost like a reclaiming of that title from the literature and from the colonial state. So that's also part of the transformation of its transformation agenda in terms of it being inclusive of our own mother tongue in our writing as young postgraduate students, and encouraging ourselves to pay homage also to our mother tongue. I think the clash between chief versus Nkosi is also given that it's two languages or trying to translate or trying to understand two different systems, because the chief sense is almost you can just speak to a multiple people, and then there's paramount chief, and then there's King Shaka, and then so that discourse and around language and using that kind of title kind of gets lost and not really explained well. So for me, opting for Nkosi kind of is also speaking to the people who understand the traditional system and where he lies within the leadership structure within cultural sense, I guess. I think that's my motivation for using that, the title for Nkosi as well.
Thanks. I mean, you will never get any South African going to call it Duke in England, Nkosi. So the titles, the question of really making the words cohere is very important. Just one last question to you, Samkelo. You are doing your master's thesis on Albert Luthuli. Can you give us a sense of just two things? The first is trying to do the history from the point of view of being a South African that's basically grown up under democracy, and trying to make sense of a period in history which in many ways, although Luthuli was so significant that, Ted Kennedy, I think it was, one of the Kennedys, came to South Africa just to meet with him and, flew all the way here. And then when he got here, insisted to the apartheid state that he's going to make take his own flight, chartered his own flight to go and meet directly with Luthuli. And that's how much of a global icon that Luthuli was at the time. But with time, obviously, memory sort of fades. And I think maybe with, the sort of stature that Mandela sort of took over, one doesn't always get a sense of that. So I just wanted a sense from you in terms of doing that research, how you approach it as somebody with that much sort of distance. And secondly, where you're finding your information, what kind of methods you're using to try and do this biography.
Okay. I think the reason Dr. Mkhize, Prof. Mkhize, you're correct in the sense that there's his memory has faded. And for me, especially when I was visiting Cape Town, Cape Town had the 4 Nobel Peace Prize, there's statues of four Nobel Peace Prize laureates. And one of the trips that they do is that they take you to this area and they ask you, who are these individuals? And a lot of people, when I was in the bus, people only noticed or could identify Nelson Mandela, Archduke Desmond Tutu, and F.W. de Klerk. But the fourth figure, no one had like an idea of who this person was until the facilitator was like, that's Nkosi Albert Luthuli. So, and also growing up in KZN itself, the curriculum and going through history, there's not really much talk about or any teaching of Nkosi Luthuli, even though he comes from the province. So that for me, I had to like engage with of how in the democratic state period, post-democracy, how the curriculum hasn't really paid homage to him or there's any really engagement, because the whole focus throughout like my engagement with history is the focus on Nelson Mandela. And I also picked it up with Prof Suttner's paper where he says there's the whole Luthuli was Mandela before Mandela was Mandela, but it should be actually the other way around, that Mandela was Luthuli before Mandela became Mandela. So because the idea of non-violence didn't just come from Nelson Mandela, but preceded him. So for me, it's trying to also uncover that hidden part of his history and make his memory living in our current context. In terms of getting information about him, I think my first visit was to the Albert Luthuli Museum in Grootville, Estenga in KZN, and much of the material, even though like the archivists there, they were saying that there's a lot of materials not easily accessible to the public in terms of his personal writings and stuff. And a lot of universities still house some of his personal documents. So you can go to the museum itself, but everything is no physical archival material that the house itself holds. So then my mission now is going to these different universities like Wits University. Even when I met Vincent, the biographer that Prof Suttner cites, he also said most of his research was housed in Wits University, which I also found very peculiar in terms of what's Gauteng doing with KZN royal son kind of thing. Then I've also made in contact with UKZN, more so with Killie Campbell Museum. They've housed much of his earlier journal writings, given that he also wrote quite a few journal articles within KZN itself. So his material is stretched all across the country. There's not really one central point. So as a young researcher, you then have to source out funding to go to these different universities, seek approval, whereas if there's an entire archive called the Luthuli Museum and you can't get or access the material. So it's a big struggle as well for a young academic like myself, definitely.
Thanks, Prof Suttner. As we move towards closure, if there are no other questions, Prof Suttner, I'll attend to this comment, and then I just have another final comment question to ask about the present day debates.
What's important also is that some archives are in the United States, and I was not able to access these because of funding and things like that. Vincent has got hold of them. Thandeka Luthuli had, when she went into exile, taken these, and they are deposited in the United States, and they're not available here. So you need quite a lot of funds to do the research, to travel around the country, but also to go overseas and see the archives.
I mean, sorry, I just need to correct myself. It was Robert Kennedy, the other Kennedy. Yes.
He came out to see Luthuli, was invited by NUSAS to, but then he saw Luthuli as the most important part of his visit.
Okay. So I think this is a thing that we face a lot of South African history. We find that a lot of photographic archives and a lot of just records are somehow not located within South Africa. And so one of the things that I think is important that's coming out of this series, apart from the fact that we are busy recording all of this, is that we have to make the archive exist. And it's not obvious up until you need to do research on people. So having people like yourself, Prof Suttner, and others that we will ask to help us in developing this series, having people actually tell their histories, their own interpretations of them and how they live through them is important for this reason, because we just don't know. And there's a lot of things also about that the armed struggle or the liberation movements that are just not written down or not known. And so for us, this is part of making our own archive and making sure that Mandela University sort of develops this practice continuously of making the archive itself. So the final question, Prof Cherry's hand is up, but I cannot see it. No, I haven't seen it, sorry. I don't unfortunately, I don't see the hands. Prof Cherry, please go ahead. If I haven't seen you, just put in the chat box, because I can't see hands. So let me just let Prof Cherry speak and just put on your video and your mic.
Hi, okay. Hi, morning everybody. Thanks very much, Samkelo and Raymond. I had two quick points. The one was, I thought it was a really interesting point about Chief Albert Luthuli's, what did you call it, infant feminism. And this idea that, I mean, he coming as a Zulu chief and traditional leadership being associated, I mean, particularly Zulu leadership being associated with strongly with patriarchy, and how he managed to shift those boundaries a bit. Anyway, I thought that was a really, really interesting observation. And I think it had a lot to do with the culture of the ANC at the time, as well as his own personal position as a Christian leader. But the other point about the armed struggle, just to go back to the 50s, I'm putting forward an idea which I'm not sure if either of you will agree with, which is that there was something of a continuity between the 50s organization and the style of the Defiance campaign and other campaigns and the armed struggle. And why I'm saying so is there was this culture of disciplined nonviolence where volunteers wore uniforms, they were bound by a strict code of conduct, an oath of loyalty, etc. And that continued into the way in which MK operated. And I think that contributed a lot to the restraint with which MK conducted the armed struggle. So there was an ethics, there was a code of conduct in the armed struggle, which was, I've got to say, I mean, this was for me one of the big takes from the Truth Commission was the real difference between the way in which MK functioned and other liberation movements and other armed struggles that we are familiar with. And I'm just thinking that there was more continuity. You know, we sometimes think of it as this big break, you know, like there was all this public, legal, peaceful organization, and then suddenly it stopped, and then there was an armed struggle. But I think there was something in the culture of that armed struggle which came from the 50s and from the leadership of Luthuli.
Thanks, Prof. Cherry. Prof. Suttner, you want to respond to that?
Yeah, I didn't speak of infant feminism, some Kello did. I would say embryonic, and I would relate it. I think the word traditional leadership is not, I think, apt for Luthuli. And I think that his embryonic feminism has a lot to do with his marriage, where it was a marriage of equality, and there was no such thing as girls' work and boys' work. Boys had to iron and cook, things like this. And according to Mabengu, this came from the Christian community in Groutville. It wasn't just her, according to her, but this was a very distinct aspect of the gender equality, I think, was manifested in the first place in his marriage and in his parenthood. Regarding the restraints, you know, I think there's a lot of, in South African history, there's a lot of ruptures and there are a lot of continuities. And even after the ANC was declared illegal, some people continued to take minutes of meetings and things like this, which took them very long to learn. They didn't want to abandon this, even though the organization was illegal. So that I think what Janet has referred to is one element of continuity that remained, but there were many others as well. I just want to say, just in case I don't say it, I really appreciate the work that Samkelo is doing, and I really hope that I can help as much as possible. I appreciated the input that he made on my paper.
Yeah, Samkelo, we're looking forward to a good master's as a finished master's. Ne? Yes, so I think that point that Prof. Cherry was making is important, and it's a point that I think we within the humanities cluster at Mandela have been trying to make, that the rootedness within all these many indigenous traditions is what informs, even though there's a lot of feeding of ideas, but this rootedness in all the many practices of African Christianity, of mainstream African Christianities, you know, the Methodist tradition, Anglican tradition, and what you're calling her Mapengu is very important. You're calling her Mapengu, you're not calling her Ms. Luthuli, she's Mapengu. So the African indigenous naming of this woman by herself itself just puts her in a state, in a space of authority. And I think all these traditions are important, and they carry through time, because this is how you build norms and ethics and ways of being, and not taking, as Alpi Sex says all the time, what or Tambo said, which is you don't take your authority, your morals from the enemy. You don't say, well, white people do this, so we will do the same. Well, the apartheid regime does that, so we will carry our armed struggle as brutally as they brutalize us. You don't take your ethics from the enemy. You take your ethics from where your umbilical cord lies, and that's where your people lie, and people like Albert Luthuli lie. Prof. Okeja, do you want to make that comment? Just voice it. It says, Chief Luthuli and other icons clearly built up a form of moral capital that may be invoked to deal with contemporary problems. For instance, Luthuli was both a chief and a modern politician. This means he successfully transcended the tradition-modernity dichotomy. How should we leverage their achievements to create a vision for the future? Do you want to make a comment? Do you want to make that comment? Do you want to put on your mic and make that comment, or is it enough that I've read it? You can switch on your mic if you want to engage. It's fine. Okay, so I think we will take that as the final comment, Prof. Suttner. and so that we can wrap up the discussion.
Well, I think we have got a lot to learn from Luthuli, both that he did inhabit a number of worlds is very important, and that he did not look down on any of these worlds. And that was why he was able to inhabit them and lead them. In my view, what we have most to learn from in the present is that Luthuli did have the opportunity for enrichment as a chief. Many other chiefs who had criminal jurisdiction enriched themselves through that. He refused to impose fines. So that would be my my response to what we have to learn primarily about Luthuli. But what I think is also important is that he was a lay preacher, as Samkelo said, but a lot of what he had to say stands very well with modern liberation theology, so that he was in many ways inhabiting modernity as well as the chiefdom in Grautville. So what I think is we shouldn't try to box people like Luthuli into one category because he inhabited so many.
With that, I'd like to thank Prof Suttner, thank Samkelo and everyone for attending. I just want to say that I think what we are developing through these conversations, not just the ones here, but the ones happening across the space, is this ability to really look at historical questions in this layered way, and not come in with one paradigm. Can someone switch it off? Thank you. I just remembered that our students are famous for giving the term magunyo macala into student politics. So we have very militant student politics here. But what I think is also amazing about the militancy of the Mandela students, very sort of militant politics, is that it also comes with an umbilical sense of being rooted in critical conversation that has a very deep and rich layer of history and of Africanist traditions, and of being able to engage people like yourself, Prof Suttner, and therefore sort of that tradition of both pushing the boundaries very far, but also knowing where you come from, which I think is extremely important. I just want to make one last announcement. The next talk will be between Prof Suttner and Mazibuko Jaha, who is himself a former member of the South African Communist Party. I know that neither of you want to have that conversation. I would have loved to know, what does it feel like to be kicked out of your movements? But anyway, it's fine, or to leave your movements. But definitely it should be interesting between the two of them. And then after this one, we will have one final one in November with another young person from Mandela University to wrap up the series, this intergenerational conversation. So with that, I'd like to thank everybody and have a good day. You can find all of these on YouTube. At some point, we will send a link. Ellen, do you want to just say goodbye to everyone? Thank you. Okay, thank you, everyone. Thank you all.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you all.